In a recent video, I casually remarked that Don Quixote is probably the first novel ever written, and very quickly I started to notice a flood of comments pushing back, kindly, of course. The most common counterexample people brought up was the Tale of Genji, which was something that was written approximately 600 years before Don Quixote. And this really started to get me thinking. They were right, but also I was right. And that's usually the moment where conversations like this go a bit off the rails. People start arguing past one another, using the same word understood to have slightly different meanings. And this can descend very quickly into what I call the intellectual death zone, where this is where we go when we are so certain we know that we are right, but we fail to recognize that we haven't yet established a common ground upon which to frame our disagreement. This is where we likely agree, but we don't see that we're talking about two different things. But in this video, instead of picking a side, I want to slow down and ask a more fundamental question. What do we actually mean when we say the first novel? Because until we define novel, the question just can't have a clear answer simply. And we're wasting our time if we're debating. Now, this sounds like a straightforward question, but the truth is it isn't. And the difficulty isn't the history. Obviously, Genji came before Don Quixote by a long shot. It's the language. When we talk about the novel, we often use it as if the name clearly defines a category of things, something with fixed boundaries. But that's not really how words like novel work. It's not referencing this immutable category, it's a word we use to group together works that resemble one another in a set of particular ways. It's inexact, but generally overlapping references. So we have to get rid of this habit of using the word as if it has a precise definition built in, inherent to it, and look first and foremost very closely at how we're actually using the word novel in the first place. There's no official checklist, but most people consider the novel to contain the following criteria. It has to be a long prose narrative, it has to be about fictional characters, it has to contain psychological depth that's not characteristic necessarily of other styles of literature. It has to have characters that develop over time, and it has to have events that follow a sort of causal or realistic structure. Now, before you get mad, of course, not every novel hits all of these criteria perfectly, and I can imagine a lot of people can think of counterexamples. But the more of these we have, the more it feels like a novel. And that feels like part might sound kind of unsophisticated, but it's super important because it's not a question of science here. This is a question of convention that we're really talking about, if we're being honest. So at this point, you're probably asking, why don't we just go all the way back? Why not just consider something like The Odyssey to be the first novel? It's got a plot, great characters, but there are other criteria that it just doesn't meet, right? It's written in a poetic style, not prose. The characters are more like archetypes. They don't have that necessarily that psychological complexity that we expect in novels. Also, the structure, it's more episodic, mythic, not grounded and as realistic as novels are wont to be, of course, with exceptions. Most people would agree that this is an incredible work, but it just belongs in a different literary tradition. So calling the Odyssey a novel feels wrong. When people talk about novels, they generally don't mean the Odyssey. We can probably throw that out. What about taking another angle? If psychological depth is one of the key criteria we care about, we could take a look at Shakespeare. I mean, Shakespeare has immense and arguably unprecedented psychological depth in his characters. Macbeth, Lear, Falstaff, Othello, Iago, Hamlet. I mean, these are some of almost unbearably deep human personages. They're not archetypes at all, right? His work is full of inner conflict, self-doubt, indecision. It's this deep access to characters' inner lives. But we still don't call Shakespeare's plays novels, right? I mean, they're written for stage, for one, and for another, they have a very different structure. The way the story unfolds is just simply doing something different than what we expect in the normative novel. So even though there's psychological depth present, we can pretty comfortably categorize Shakespeare's works as not novels. So clearly, no single feature on its own can turn something into a novel, as we've seen with The Odyssey or with, the works of Shakespeare. But what about early works that seem to meet many of the criteria? Not just one or two, like Homer and Shakespeare. And so we can take a look now at the Tale of Genji, where we start to see a lot of those criteria really coalesce. It's 11th century Japan, and suddenly we have deep psychological depth. complex relationships and emotions, a sustained prose narrative, attention to the social reality of the world. It feels very novelistic, right? It certainly is genuinely unprecedented in how many of the characteristics of what we refer to as novels it contains. We can recognize the inner lives of the characters and it feels familiar, right? And just to be clear, I haven't read all of the Tale of Genji, just portions of it in translation. But even from that, it can feel a bit diffuse, more episodic, more impressionistic. It doesn't really have a tight narrative continuity that we tend to expect from novels. So if we see a novel as requiring this kind of unified, continuous arc, I think that's where Genji starts to diverge a bit, right? And again, like Homer and Shakespeare, it's just doing something different. It's not a criticism of the work at all, which is really why I think most critics refer to Genji as a proto-novel. It has many of the features that later come together in the modern novel. And again, there's going to be debates. Some critics consider one thing, another thing a novel. And now we finally get to Don Quixote. And I think the reason this is generally considered the first novel is this is where the majority of readers start to say, that's it. This is familiar. This is recognizably the format, normatively novelistic. Because now we have the clear character arcs and the novel structure, the transforming narrative. We have the reality versus illusion trope, which is all throughout novels. We have a certain self-awareness and of the craft of storytelling itself. It's really reflecting on what stories are in their deepest nature, which is also one of the criteria I think that one could argue is quintessentially novelistic and one that becomes a model for later novels to build on too. So I think that's often why it's called the first novel. Now, who's right? The truth is there's no final authority here. This isn't a scientific question, there's no objective answer. It depends a lot on things like literary tradition, cultural perspective, which might change over time, and what we decide counts as essential in terms of the criteria. Now, this is where things get philosophical and really interesting. When we argue about the first novel, we tend to treat it like a fixed object, like it's waiting to be discovered just behind the river bend or whatever. Now, philosophers like Bertrand Russell tried to build systems like this in mathematics, clean, precise categories with clear boundaries. And if we accept Russell's worldview, things get confusing really fast. How do we define categories, right? What's considered a part of this category, that category? What about the edge cases? That's why we need his pupil turned teacher, Ludwig Wittgenstein. He pushes back against his former teacher, Bertrand Russell, in Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, and he says that's not how language works. Categories aren't like novel, aren't rigid atomic things. They're shaped by how we use them. Now, decades later, Wittgenstein returns to philosophy and he explores in philosophical investigations even more deeply how language influences the way that we use things. Refers to these as family resemblances, not one shared essence, like Russell thinks. Everything is just, can be defined as novelly or not novelly, right? Uh, there's no, you know, immutable characteristic called novelistic or something like that. It's overlapping similarities. And with this small tweak, I think a lot of that confusion dissipates. Because if we try to force something like the first novel into a perfectly defined category, we end up creating confusion about what qualifies and what doesn't. What gives meaning to the word novel isn't a hitting definition that we just need to watch one more video in order to understand finally. It's simply how we actually use the term in real life. We use it to group together works that resemble each other in structure, style, and psychological depth, right? So understood this way, a novel is more of a literary convention that emerges gradually than this category, right? When we ask what the first novel is, we're really asking what counts as a novel and how are we using the word. And depending on how we answer that, we get different answers. With a broader definition, we might say that Genji is the first novel. A more narrow, more familiar one points to Don Quixote. Maybe we'll land somewhere else if we use different criteria. There's no single definitive first novel. Only works that resemble what we mean by novel, more or less. So if you like this kind of video, please leave a comment, like and subscribe, and make sure to turn on the bell icon to receive notifications when I release new videos. But I'm curious, what did you guys think? What do you guys think the first novel is and why? Okay? Thank you for watching, and until next time, take care.